Okay, welcome. This is the uh, uh, well, it's maybe like the fifth or the sixth of Can't Make Time, but it's the third of Can't Make Time, in which we've been making some steady and wonderful progress. So Hadley's going to take us away again. Like
Yeah, so before we get going, I wanted to recap from where we began. Um, we began with the question, how is it possible to change the world? And this question had sort of two flavors to it. A theoretical element, what is the world? What is the object that we know that we call world? And a practical element, how do we relate to the world that we're in? And I suggested that these two questions are deeply interwoven and have ramifications for one another, and that Kant is concerned with them both. I wanted to plug, I met somebody this week, Rock Bencin, who released a book recently called Rethinking the Concept of World Toward Transcendental Multiplicity. He was very cool, very clear and articulate, and his work deals specifically with the concept of world and how the concept of world has been sort of developed since Kant and Leibniz. He's more interested in multiple worlds and possible world theory, especially as it arises in the works of Alain Badiou and Charles Deleuze. So very cool. He's also working on a set of papers interested in Jacob von Uexküll, who is a influential biologist that not many people speak about, who was very inspired by Kant. He aims to challenge a sort of Darwinian framework or an evolutionary framework by suggesting that we can't account for the activities or life actions of animal species without taking into account their specific subjectivities. And so he suggests that each animal species has a world unto its own. So he gives the example of a tick, which responds to butyric acid and like climbs towards heat so that it can find like an open hair follicle in which to embed itself. And when it comes into contact with this heat, engages with its subject and eventually falls off and dies. But these three actions, the butyric acid, the heat, and the climbing, sort of signify the life realm of the tick, or what you might call its world. Um, in more mundane terms, you might use the word environment. And one of the things that was really striking about the conversation that we had was how prevalent the concept of world is in post-Kantian philosophies and continental thinking, and how unprevalent it is in analytic philosophy. The place where it does come up in analytic philosophy is possible world theory, and that's to account for something like logic. And basically, the function there is like, can we imagine a world where this would be the case? And if we could, then it is conceivable, and so not just contingent. And the striking disparity was interesting because it relates to maybe what I was speaking about with the sort of indifferentism that we brought up the last time, or 2 weeks ago, and the sort of theoretical choices that we engage in. I mean, I made a big spiel that week about, why should we do metaphysics? Why should we focus on being? How can we fail to interact with um, the world in this way? And I think to some extent it's a valid spiel, but to another extent there are other alternative theoretical options that are out on the table. And I think it takes judgment and thinking to figure out which ones we should engage in and why we should engage in them. So reopening space for that, and then also to think about how our theoretical choices again frame our world. Because one of the reasons that analytic philosophers might not enjoy the concept of worlds is because of people like Uexküll or Badiou or Deleuze who come up with multiple worlds and seem to, at some point, create the possibility of too many worlds. So it seems like there's this overworlding that might happen in continental philosophy and this like underworlding that might happen in analytic philosophy. And so we might want to ask, what is the correct concept of world? Are there one or many? And how do we know, I guess, which one is theoretically important to us? Um, Again, by engaging with Kant, we shall, I suggest, come to see, perhaps, how to decide what the world is, or at least see one action plan for making such a theoretical decision. And by going through the preface, we shall see maybe the theoretical decision making that's informing Kant and grounding his account. So I want to quickly recap last week where we talked about Copernican turn and the ripening power of judgment, as well as the courtroom analogy. Where we left off last week, I think, was reason finding itself in the courtroom, playing judge, jury, and defendant, and the courtroom being the critique of pure reason. Before we begin, um, I want to suggest that what's going to follow is going to enrich that image and tell us more about the courtroom that is the critique of pure reason. What is the object, I guess, that is fulfilling the function of housing this debate? And how does that object, if we can call it that, inform our conception of world? So, without further ado, I think we should maybe head into the text and get on the road again.
Rad, rad. Um, yeah, let me read. How far you want me to go?
Just to the
The
end of this
paragraph,
first part,
maybe.
just the principles.
Yeah. So, yet, by this, I do not understand a critique of books and systems, but a critique of the faculty of reason in general, in respect of all the cognitions after which reason might strive independently of all experience, and hence the decision about the possibility or impossibility of a metaphysics in general, and the determination of its sources as well as its extent and boundaries, all, however, from principles. Um,
I'm gonna move this up
I
so
think
that you
my
can see the
intonation was a bit strange there.
plan. So I guess following on from the courtroom, how are you thinking about the enrichment that this line adds? Like, what does it tell us, and how is Kant viewing the courtroom that is the critique of pure reason?
Well, one of the uh, part of metabolizing the last two sessions and your framing of Kant for me has been um, it's also in line with this question that you had in terms of like what is Kant's day or his time or what is his world? Because
Mm-hmm.
there's also in which I can deeply relate with what he's speaking about. So it seems to have a um, sorry, my network is all good.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to have, yeah, it seems to have like a very real applicability. Like he could, or he seems very much to be speaking about my own reason. So
Mm-hmm.
it kind of there's a way in which it what do you say embellishes by almost dehistoricizing or making it like not so much not completely dehistoricizing it, but also dehistoricizing it. It's not just like what a critique of books and systems, but of the faculty itself. So to the degree that the faculty is being exercised, um, the critique would be relevant to it. Um, so then the 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 courtroom would almost begin to sound a little bit like um, this concept of world that you were introducing. or beginning with.
I think maybe if you want to say more about the dehistoricization, it might be worthwhile. Like, what are the elements that he's taking out of play uh, from this investigation into or this critical engagement with the reason, and I guess maybe how might it be different from the way that we ordinarily go around trying to determine the truth now, or in academia, or in ordinary life, right?
Was the second part of, yeah,
He says it's not a critique of books and systems, right?
yeah,
And I guess like maybe that sounds it does sound quite mundane, and there is maybe a very mundane way to understand it. But just think about how bizarre that is, right? In academic work or something like that, we need to find the right references. We need to find Kant or Aristotle or some historical figure whose ideas we can engage in, or some background system, right? Some methodological presupposition that we can use to guide our inquiry, right? We need a system. We say, I'm using Heidegger's framework of thrownness or something, or we say, I'm using a Darwinian concept of evolution to uh, explain the features of the species coming into being or something. I don't know. I have no idea what biologists speak about. But you get the gist, right? We use the historical aspects, right? The historical aspects are what are front and center in ordinary knowledge making, right? Um, and you might want to think about how ridiculous. I'm trying to maybe intensify the problems with doing metaphysics, right? Think about how obscure it comes off when you tell people what you study in philosophy. You say, I don't know, I study like reason or thinking. And they're like, what do you mean? Like a specific, like, isn't everything thinking? And you're like, yeah, kind of. Or like they ask you like, when you have to like apply for like, I mean, Sipho might be in the same boat. When you have to like write your thesis papers or something like that, you need to say like, yeah, I'm looking at reason from this framework, or I'm thinking about concepts under a certain like school of thinking about concepts. I mean, it's all fair and well um, that we should make these fine-grained distinctions, perhaps. But when you really think
mm,
about it, is it is it not maybe a sign of a symptom that we can't just think about reasoning anymore? That reason can't just reason about reason. That thinking can't grasp itself.
yeah,
That beings can't think about being. In the many the many modes of metaphysics that have come to be, um, we might wonder. I think I put it as hair splitting earlier on. We might want to wonder about the sort of hair splitting nature of thinking and think about like how do we how do we grasp the real truth behind our subject matter if all we ever get to is some historical book account or some systematic account of it, then it's
yeah,
always subject to some condition, isn't it? It's precisely
yeah,
dependent on some assumption of a given book or world system to exist in. It's not the thing in itself. It's not whatever truth is. If anything, it's just some contingent thing that we refer to, right? How do we ever get to
yeah,
being for ourselves? Or can we ever get to being for ourselves? Over the past like 2 sessions, I've been suggesting that we must be able to, since every single action that we do is permeated with it. But again, it seems like we've got to begin somewhere. And I
mm,
guess the challenge is if not books and systems, then where, right? Like, on the
yeah,
one hand,
yeah,
it's obvious to say I'm not going to do a critique of books and systems, and this is going to be the critique of purism. But on the other hand, what on earth do you begin with without books and systems, right? What's
yeah.
the meme like saying is we live in a society, right?
Yeah, it's a thought that recurs for me, but it's been hitting particularly hard in the last 2 weeks as we've been moving through this preface. Just the sometimes the audacity um required to like think with Kant or through or to do philosophy or metaphysics. And I mean we've been tracking the ways in which we might um avoid that, like the dogmatism, like I have my dogmatic claim that because I'm dogmatic about it, I don't have to uh look at it. I can I can just kind of rely on it being somewhere there, or I can be like skeptical and so dismissive of such a like the intimations of such inquiries, like what am I doing when I'm reasoning, or what's the ultimate nature of reality or objects, or and then the indifferentism that we tackled. But what has been uh there's something freeing to thought in letting it just become authoritative for the terms of its own thinking. So it's like uh, claiming itself, so you can think clearly without needing to defer to the particular book or system that has inspired the thinking. And that kind of that that feeds into my ongoing sense that um, whatever Kant is doing is historically important to the development of thought. Like it's a significant shift that happens, and the core of that um, is that it's then individually important to the development of one's of one's thinking. Like this, you brought in biology, so this is great. Like there's this principle of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is like the the ontogenesis or the coming to be of the particular being or the particular instance, like an animal or whatever. That whole process of its ontogeny from insemination through to growing into the type of thing that it is. It's phylogeny. The phylogeny is like the historical or evolutionary development of the type of thing that is.
Mhm.
So the the being will in each instance of ontogenesis or of the coming to be of the thing, it recapitulates the phylogenetic path that being has taken to be the shape that it is. So if you look at images of like a human fetus, it intimates the shapes of prior life forms.
Mhm.
It's like recapitulating it in its coming to in its coming to be. So then playing with that, it's like a um like a philo, but philosophy, like a phylogenesis, you know, like the coming to be of thought needs
Yeah,
to recapitulate. Yeah, yeah. So,
that
um,
sounds that sounds wonderful and great and maybe very Hegelian. I don't think it's Kantian though. I want to push you a little bit, and the reason that like the reason that I'm sticking with this critique of books and systems is that I think that it's one of the challenges to metaphysics. I mean, I think Sipho didn't you do your PhD thesis on something like this, Sipho, that we all like Foucault's critique of like this sort of thinking is that we can't get at the truth of being in itself because we're always somewhat historically conditioned and it depends on like the social circumstances that we
Yeah, the
find.
power dynamics. Yeah, as you're saying this right now, I'm thinking about it. I was a master's thesis. Unfortunately, it's not a PhD thesis yet. It would have been nice if it was. Would have been done with this shit. Yeah, yeah, I was off. biggest hurdles, because it seemed like it was very circular. Like every time I try to make a point about something being true, it seems like to have a theory of what makes something true. And about this, that came to mind.
Yeah,
I can see the problem.
so the problem's there. I want to push you on. Why isn't the problem a problem? Why don't we have to consult historical systems and books? Or why must reason be independently accessible outside of the framework of these critiques and books or systems or whatever?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, he just says he doesn't mean a critique of books and systems. I mean, I'm not sure that he does give an argument, but it's worth questioning why on earth he doesn't. It's oh cool, we're just gonna get rid of all the books and the systems and all the previous work, and then what? We're magically gonna poof reason into being or something, like as if though we didn't need texts or language or any of those things to start to even get off the ground.
And it's suppose it's even twice as confusing when we consider that the object of reason, or rather,
I dropped out. The object of reason disappears. Is that our?
I mean, yeah, it does, especially in Kant, I guess. You want to give it a shot, Dan?
Let's see, just pop back in. Are you there, Sipho?
yeah, sorry, I don't know what happened. Are you there?
Oh, good.
Can
You
you
were
hear me?
saying that, yeah, the object of reason.
Yeah, I was saying that it's also hard to think of reason devoid from an object external from reason, since we only become aware of reason when we think, we only become aware of reason because of the objects we reason about. I don't know if I'm making sense,
You're on the right track, I think.
but yeah, I can only think, like, or rather, thinking only comes to mind to me when I'm thinking about things. And then when I'm thinking about thinking, the thing that comes to mind about me, about my thinking, is when I thought about things. So I don't know how I can think about thinking without thinking about things that aren't thinking.
Yeah.
I think that's the frustration I'm having.
Yeah, I think maybe you and Dan are overthinking it again, right? And I've done this on purpose because I think it happens in the history of philosophy, maybe, right? Sometimes overthinking things is just not too good. What are books and systems?
What are they?
Yeah. What's a book?
They objects that can be experienced.
Yeah, sure. Say more about the ordinary thing that books.
People people write them usually
Yeah.
after they've experienced other objects.
But how
I think the
the
first
hell are books? You know, how are they not thoughts?
Yeah, I think the first part was the important part, what you said, right? People write
Yeah.
things, right?
Yeah.
People have written master's thesis here. Do you just write your book without reasoning? Or does reason produce books and systems? Does reason come before or after? What's the, do books and systems not depend on and presuppose the possibility of reason, right? we can't have like a philosophical system if it doesn't make sense. Like if it's just a bunch of guttural noises, it's not reasoned or coherent or a system. It's precisely not a system insofar as it's just grunts and blurts, right? And it's not a book insofar as there's no
Mm,
storyline or pagination or, I don't know, paper maybe, right? And where do
mm,
we and how do we get that? I don't know. We have to reason about how to use the axe to chop down the tree or something to figure out. I mean, books are pretty technologically advanced, right? Maybe
Yeah.
we always find ourselves historically situated within a community of reasoners. That might be fine. Some sort of oral practice of making noises and then assigning those noises to certain thoughts or whatever. But, that's something different than my work is always beholden to the history of human products, right? In fact, the history of human products or the history of products themselves seems like precisely the type of thing that we need reason, whatever reason turns out to be,
mm,
to get at, right? To have any sort of tool or any sort of end, we must know the purpose of the thing for the sake of, and we must be able to, organize it. It'll turn out that I'm going to be equivocating on what reason is for Kant quite a lot here, but I think at the outset of the book, there's no reason not to, especially to explain these sorts of, I want to say, issues that come up later on that maybe block us from getting back into it. Um, because there are many obstacles to sitting down and reasoning about reason, right? The critique of the faculty of reason in general, in respect to all the knowledge
Mm.
after which reason might strive independently of experience, and hence the decision about the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics in general, uh, and the determination of its sources as well as its extent and boundaries, or however from principles, right? Like the blockages in the way of engaging with the project of just reasoning about reason, just good old pure reason, whatever that is, uh, seem to be significant. And I think they have maybe some apparent justification at first sight when we try to think about them. But when we get lost in the source that we can't reason about pure reason, what are we doing? Right? It seems like we're undercutting our very own capacity as the type of rational beings that we are
Yeah.
misunderstanding our very selves in this process of trying to comprehend what we are. Um,
What, so how are you expressing the getting lost there? The getting lost is having reason concern itself with the critique of books and systems rather than concerning itself um, with itself or uh, with the cognitions uh, that it has or that strive after that which is
I don't think
independent of all
I don't think it's fair to cash it out as that it's always wrong to have a critique of books and systems in certain subjects. I think
yes,
that's the
yes,
correct way to proceed, right? Like literary
yeah,
is going to be a critique of books and systems. That's what it is by its very nature, right? But
yeah,
I think reason can misunderstand itself when it says that all we can ever do, when it makes the metaphysical claim that we can never
yes,
get to reason itself. And when it makes the metaphysical claim not off of reason's own authority, not off of the very assertion that it's taking itself to be making, but off of the contingent historical circumstances in which it finds itself, right? Of
yeah, yeah,
some being here now, that sees itself and sees its reason as fundamentally constrained by books and systems, thinkers and thoughts, as if though reason weren't necessary in the first place to make those cultural artifacts. So
the
reason why I'm highlighting all of this stuff is that, like, not only does it block the way to engaging with the critique of your reason, but in any self-investigation into reason, there's always going to be the potential for misunderstanding, right? So there might be the case that other people have gotten it wrong, but there might also be the case that even if the project that Kant is engaging in is itself fundamentally correct, he might have made a few missteps in the project. And so we should be on the lookout for that, because he has been criticized many times, especially for being a bad writer or not explaining his arguments. So one might want to, just think through some of the issues involved with engaging with this project, so we can open up the possibility of engaging with it again, and then maybe try and take the thinking of reason independently of all experience, whatever that turns out to mean, seriously again.
yeah
Right?
yeah 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 it's almost like the critique itself is like it's a concealed admission of the possibility of metaphysics, almost, by even attempting to do it by and then it enters like
Well,
the question, like, can we do it, or what do we mean by doing it?
yeah, so I mean, he says, and hence the decision about the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics in general, right? Remember, the indifferentists don't
Yeah,
think that it's possible. The dogmatists think that metaphysics is possible. The skeptics aren't so sure. And the indifferentists
yeah,
are, not too hot about it. So it seems like nobody is that hot about it except the dogmatists in the history of philosophy. And not only that, we might want to ask the question, this passage is really good. You might want to ask the question, why must metaphysics come to a decision about the possibility or impossibility of itself? Isn't that strange for a science?
yeah. The it was making me think about what we were reading last week in terms of the way in which the emergence of indifferentism is also, um Sipho says, network is breaking my balls. It, the emergence the emergence of indifferentism is also connected to the ripening power of judgment, which
Yeah.
is like a um so it's like the because indifference is kind of an attitude, or maybe it's not even an attitude about the possibility or impossibility of a metaphysics, but it's like, yeah, I guess, I mean, I'm not sure what to say. It seems like metaphysics needs to continually do that, establish itself. Why? The
Well, I mean, there's one way that you can think about it from maybe the skeptical side of things, right? But there's another way that you can think about it from the dogmatic side of things. And I imagine that they would be the same, really. So what does the skeptic say? Well, Descartes skeptic, we can't trust anything, right? Anything that we take for granted is going to inform how we like see the world. And so this is an oversimplification, obviously. Um, any assumption that we have and bring to bear on our science is going to make our science beholden to that assumption. And if we can knock that assumption over, then the rest of the science falls with it. And from the dogmatic side, I guess, any sort of thing that we take for granted about being is not going to be, or even any being that we take for granted, right? Any object that appears has a certain character, and if we take that character for granted, then it's going to turn out that there's something that we've just taken up into our account of being, and whether that conforms or not to reality is inaccessible because it's an assumption, right? Any assumption that we use in a science is going to condition that science, both in its content and in the way that it proceeds, both in content and in method. So metaphysics is the assumptionless science, right? We need to not bring any of our own assumptions to bear, which is again a big problem in the history of philosophy and in general that people, are not so sure can be solved, but also must be able to be solved if Kant is, engaged in something. So metaphysics must decide its own possibility. It has to come up with its own criterion and its own rules and principles, I guess is how he says, about how to figure out what it is, what the objects it deals with are, uh, how far the scope of being applies, how to limit its science, right? Which is probably the explanation for why like authors like Aristotle and Kant, etc., are running around for half the text figuring out what the thing that we're studying is in the first place, because we can't come in knowing, right? We knowing comes later, right? Once we know what knowing is, then maybe we can know. But at the outset, we're just in the thick of it. We find ourselves in a context, right? We find ourselves historically and socially here. We've got this cultural artifact, the critique of pure reason. We open up the text. It's a lot of words, I guess. And we have to, I mean, we don't have to, but those of us that take it up and think through it, figure out, what on earth the science is and what we're doing, what metaphysics is, what it's been taken to be, how it plays out, and what we're really thinking about when we try to think about being, whatever that means, or reason, all these
Yeah.
all these words that are the most natural slip of the tongue phrases that we use every day. I mean, we might not use being anymore because it's grandiose, but we might use exists or existence sometimes. And so, I don't know, we use all these words and we say all these things, and we kind of have some vague feeling what they must mean. But, when we try to think about it, it's really hard, it turns out.
Yeah. Ah, I would want to say it's we we do need to do it. I think that's why I was this historical account, and also this the development of the individual, and because I mean down the line from Kant, and I don't want to detract too much, but maybe it's just like an embellishment, like I don't know, like critical theory or um uh people who are trying to make the case that uh like the subject's position affects their knowing, or there's something about what's the expression, like the locus of enunciation, that is important for the conveyance of knowledge and the reception of knowledge. And um, if if that's kind of disregarded, um, then you have the situation where knowledge is um, this objective system or thing that isn't really related to the subjects that produce it, or that relate to it, or that are formed by it, and so then you get like the potential for this autonomous outside object that subjects can then uh, hide themselves in relation to, and I guess that can be harmful.
Yeah, sure.
But so then that's at least I think where I'm plugging in most is I have a sense that this whatever the critique is gesturing towards is something like metabolizing the movement that um, uh, nullifies or prompts one to become uh, free from maybe the autonomous objective existence of something that was actually postulated or was actually an inheritance or um,
Yeah, I think maybe we should like hold that in abeyance and maybe think about it like as we go on and see whether that's the case or whether there is like some objective thing that
yes,
is kind of
yeah,
obscure. I think that's something that we can think about further on. I think should move a little bit from this passage and get on to the
uh,
next. I think we spent enough time on it probably. Um, and yeah, just before I lead off, just to finish that embellishment that I was suggesting about the courtroom, I think you did bring it out a little bit, but I wanted to suggest that the courtroom has now been transformed into the faculty of reason itself, right? Reason itself, uh, not the books or the systems, but reason itself must come to determine itself from principles. And so it is the housing structure, the participants in the game, and all the goings on in the courtroom that is the critique of pure reason. Or reason is the courtroom that is.
yes. Okay, how do you um so there's this history of books and systems,
Mhm.
and one of the kind of or the books maybe that we are particularly interested in are those ones that are engaging reason and being or some project of metaphysics. Um, and then we have that reflection that you induced or invited earlier in terms of thinking about doesn't reason kind of precede the artifacts of reason or its products? So
Mhm.
this is not a critique of the books, it's of the faculty itself. So then it's almost the invitation is something like um, reason coming into its own courtroom. I mean, is the claim that hasn't quite happened pre Kant? The invitation is that it's now the time for reason to step into its own, to examine itself, to come to its self-understanding, and before now it hasn't quite done that.
Yeah, so we discussed this courtroom, right? Reason must take on anew the most difficult of its task, namely that of self-knowledge, and to institute a course of justice by which reason may secure its rightful claims while dismissing all its groundless pretensions, and this not by mere decrees, but according to its own unturnable and unchangeable laws. And so last week I gave you the analogy, and I told you to imagine that like reason is the defendant and the plaintiff and the jury and the like reason is playing all these different roles in the courtroom, right? It's on trial and it has to make a decision about the defendants in the courtroom, and then it has to like somehow mediate and reason about this outcome as like what the onlookers do. I can't remember what they're called right now. But so it's playing these like functional roles. And what I wanted to suggest was that in the original analogy I gave you, it was inside the courtroom, much like reason is contained in books and systems. But once we realized that these are the products of reason, or that reasoners must be using reason to reason, however we want to say it, then the situation sort of flips and inverts. And the sort of people that are reasoning find themselves in a courtroom that is itself, one might want to call the space of reason, right? It's reason itself, or something like that. So like the image flips from the sort of microcosm that is the ongoings of the trial, and we think that those are the reasoners and that's reason engaging with itself. But it turns out all along they're in this preeminent place of reason that is reason, and where reason comes to be, gets put on trial, and comes to figure itself out, right? It's no more, we're no more at the vantage point of the embodied person at the stand. We are now at the, I want to say, aerial view of the room itself. And we slip from
And the root.
we slip from this like embodied lived experience to like this bird's eye view of the ongoings around us.
Okay. The the room itself is reason, like the court, reason is the court, reason.
Yeah. So I guess, and maybe
I think you're.
my Wi-Fi.
You just came through, but I was missing you for a bit.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, maybe it's not super necessary to hop on about this analogy, but the way that I'm seeing it is that
Yeah.
we sort of switch from this embodied at the stand, on defense and on trial sort of thing, and judgmental state where
Yeah.
we find ourselves within the world that is reason, or whatever you want to call that, the courtroom that is the critique of pure reason. We find
Yeah.
ourselves in
And
the
moving
courtroom.
between positions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and now we've become the courtroom that is pure reason. It turns out that it's not
Okay.
necessarily the judge or the defendants that are deciding over the trial, that reason itself
Yeah.
is sort of taking an aerial view on the matter and looking at itself from a higher standpoint, so to speak.
Yes. Yeah, this is almost the nature of reason that we started with, this like self-transcending.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah,
go on.
and sweet. So it is on this path that, just stop me when you think it's good. It's on this path, the only one left, that I have set forth, and I flatter myself that in following it, I have succeeded in removing all those errors that have so far put reason into dissension with itself in its non-experiential use. I have not avoided reason's questions by pleading the incapacity of human reason as an excuse. Rather, I have completely specified these questions according to its principles. And after discovering the point where reason has misunderstood itself, I have resolved them to reason's full satisfaction. To be sure, the answer to these questions has not turned out just as dogmatically enthusiastic lust for knowledge might have expected, for the latter could not be satisfied except through magical powers in which I am not an expert. Yet this was also not the intent of our reason's natural vocation, and the duty of philosophy was to abolish the semblance arising from misinterpretation, even if many prized and beloved delusions have to be destroyed in the process.
I think that should be good.
In this business, yeah,
Yeah, it's a fair amount of
uh,
text. A big chunk.
yeah, yeah.
Begin at the
This,
beginning of it.
it's reason's non-experiential.
Yeah.
Begin at the beginning.
No, you
Sweet.
can continue with reasons non-experiential. These, I think that's interesting.
Say again.
You can begin with its non-experiential use if you're interested in that.
Um, so I've succeeded in removing all those errors that have so far put reason into dissension with itself in its non-experiential use. So that's this image of the the quandaries that metaphysics putting in, presenting to itself these kind of irreconcilable problems or differences, and there was something about those problems that were reason applying itself to non-experience, or so I wonder what those errors are. Um,
It's
am
non-experiential
I
use
getting the
independent of all
yeah?
experience, something like that. Might be the other way that he puts it.
Yeah. So wait. So we aiming at the use of reason in its independence from experience,
Mhm.
but then we also aiming at um removing the errors that reason falls into when it is used in a non-experiential or
Yeah, we're trying to figure out how to use reason correctly in its non-experiential use, right? So there has been maybe attempts made in the past to use reason independently of all experience. There might be certain things that we've talked about um, that come into that category, I would imagine. I'm not sure that we've gotten there in the text. I don't want to spoil the surprise and talk about what those might be. But I mean, in the history of metaphysics, there might be speak about some sort of things that don't fall within the domain of experience, some imperceivable stuff maybe um, that
mm,
can never be experienced, but we only know somewhat indirectly or something like that. And how do we check that? Might be the issue, right? Uh, how do we know that our thoughts apply to being? How do we know that you know it's not all just a dream? Um, how do we know whether the world began to exist at some specific point in time, or just always existed? These are some of the claims that might be important to think about. Um, and so people might have offered answers to these, and the offers they might have answered might be correct or they might be incorrect. And I think we need to figure out, just as we can't read the books and get the knowledge that we need to figure out how to know things um, from that, we also need some sort of way to figure out, it's really hard to decide whether your own reasoning is correct in some way. And so even if you do read the historical books of philosophy of the systems and whatnot, how do you know whether any of them are right? Right? They're all giving reasons and they're giving arguments. How do you evaluate those arguments? How do you evaluate those reasonings? Um, you've got to sort of figure out
mm,
what reason is doing in those domains. I'm not sort of suggesting that you have to read Kant to understand the history of philosophy. It sounds a little bit backwards thinking, but rather that like what Kant is doing is, at least for himself, maybe trying to get clear on what reason is and how it works independently of experience, uh, if it does at all, right? These are
mm.
issues that are sort of open and on the table.
That that last bit didn't come through, but I mean, just the last sentence. Um, so like the I guess I'm wondering most about how um what errors put reason into dissension with itself in its non-experiential use. Um,
I think we might have read something about this earlier on. Let's see if we did. Might have been all the way at the beginning. Yeah, it was. First paragraph,
Yeah.
right? Reason falls into this perplexity through no fault of its own. It begins from principle whose use is unavoidable in the course of experience and at the same time sufficiently warranted by it. With these principles, it also arises as its nature also requires ever higher to more remote conditions. But since it becomes aware in this way that its business must always remain incomplete, um, it sees itself necessitated to take refuge in principles that overstep all possible use and experience, and yet seems so unsuspicious that even ordinary common sense agrees with it. But it thereby falls into obscurity and contradictions from which it can indeed surmise that it must somewhere be proceeding on the ground of hidden errors. But it cannot discover them, for the principles on which it is proceeding, since they surpass the bounds of all experience, no longer recognizing any touchstone of experience, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's this maybe it's a curiosity of the path that he's following then, the only one that is left.
Yeah.
Um, and it's this play between the non-experiential use and that he both seems to be wanting to open the question as to whether reason has a non-experiential use or even existence,
Mhm.
or but then um, yeah, so maybe I'm just kind of stating the question. Um,
Well, I mean, you can read the next line, right? What follows after its non-experiential use?
I have not avoided reason's questions by pleading the incapacity of human reason as an excuse. Rather, I have completely specified these questions according to principles. And after discovering the point where reason has misunderstood itself, I have resolved them to reason's full satisfaction.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the it is the preface. So um, I'm looking
Well, I mean,
I'm looking forward.
think about what we've been talking about, right? In this like sort of session, right? That, this critique of books and histories, we find ourselves thrown into the world and, we can't actually access reason. And the whole time, Kant just keeps intensifying this problem because it's the preface. Um, there's these dogmatists who try to think being straight off the bat, and then the skepticists come along and they're like, no, we're not having any of that. You can't think about being straight away. And then the indifferentists come on the scene, and it's like, oh, we don't even care. We're just gonna like do our own thing and just think. Um, and
Yes,
like
okay.
each of these phases, we're like faced by like, eh, I don't know. We're only human, Dan. Don't you know that? Like, didn't you know all along? Like, we're just humans. Like, we can't think being, right? Don't be ridiculous. It's not like, I don't know. Are we capable of doing that? Doesn't seem like it. We keep getting it wrong, right? So how do we ever think about it? And yet,
Yeah,
Kant, I think, maybe has the courage to say, I'm not going to avoid it because it's unavoidable.
yeah,
So he's not avoiding
yeah,
reasons, the capacity of human reason as an excuse. You have to, you have to accept it's going to be difficult. It's been, I don't know how many years it was, a philosophizing that was already on the scene before Kant came on it and was like, I'm going to try and change the game. But probably a long time. Like, it was a good while. And I imagine that it's even longer for us now that, us new beginners that come on and go, man, how do we even get started? It's a lot of work to get started, right? This is why it's easy to avoid the critique of pure reason, right? It's look at how
mm,
thick this book is, man. Isn't it all the easier to
yeah,
just like put it down?
yeah, yeah. And our approach, the there was something that shone a bit differently there as you referred back to the dogmatist, the skeptic, and the indifferentist.
Mm,
Um, the the dogmatists, the expression you use, they take themselves to be able to read the character of being off being itself. So they almost like are in an excess of this non-experiential use of reason. Then the skeptic is like, no, you guys just like write these th things and you leave us these books and systems about this something that like I'm not really sure you can know about. Um, I'm gonna doubt all of that. I'm gonna doubt your capacity to know. Um, and then yeah, I guess that's more on the side of um, pleading the incapacity of human reason. But then there's an implicit kind of contradiction because you're exercising reason to do that. Um, and then the indifferentists are just tired, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think that shone through maybe because of the passage, right? To be sure, the answer to these questions has not turned out just as dogmatically enthusiastic lust for knowledge might have expected. I mean, he goes off on the sassy line, for the latter could not be satisfied except through magical powers in which I am not an expert, right? Um, it might just be
Yeah.
excess, right? We might just be like basking in the glory of being as if though it's there, but it's just maybe it is just illusory as the skeptics suggest, right? Maybe it's too much,
Yeah.
um, and maybe skepticism is like a little bit like too little, right? It's just maybe like because think about how skepticism ends, right? Do we get any sort of new cognition from it? I mean, in Descartes, we have to get back to God, and then we do get back to God, but that's not really skepticism anymore, right? That's theology, I would imagine.
Mm.
Um, but for like more like modern skeptics like Hume, we get some knowledge, maybe, um, not much. And for real old school, I guess, ancient skeptics, it was just all about, doubting stuff, right? We could get appearance, um,
Mm.
but yeah, any claim that was put forward was there to be like tested, and this was like a lifelong process of just like we're just going to skeptically test these claims. So there might be like no positive cognition from something like skepticism. But if we read this line, and then I'm gonna have to unfortunately bounce soon. Um,
Yeah.
Yet this
All
was
good.
also not the intent of our reason's natural vocation, and the duty of philosophy was to abolish the semblance arising from misinterpretation, even if many prized and beloved delusions have to be destroyed in the process. Right? Um, he seems
Yeah.
to be suggesting like there's a purpose to philosophy, right? And there's like some sort of exercise that we're supposed to be engaged in when engaging in philosophy. And the exercise is not to save our like um, beloved delusions, right? It's not to hold on to what we thought must have been the case when we first began, but to seriously think about it and to see whether we've misunderstood the issues and if we have to, check out
Mm.
some of the things that we take for granted or some of the illusions that we've come to believe, then so much the better for philosophy, right?
Mm.
I was saying like there's a short text that I was writing the other week, and I was like it was about truth and accessing it and stuff like that. And I was like, wouldn't it be sad if we can't? And then I was like, first principle of logic for children, that like we avoid every conclusion that makes us sad, um, just because it's realistic. And maybe there's some like ring of truth to that. Like we don't want to come to conclusions that are disappointing or is not as magical as that, like, they could be.
Yes.
Some people, I think, have the opposite affliction, that they don't want to come to any conclusions that are magical or as enchanting as they could
Yeah.
be. But probably the right place to be in is to have some sort of in between where the conclusions aren't too magical or not too boring, right? There's
Yeah.
some space, there's some sort of wiggle room where, it's still pretty
What is
cool that we get to do this.
this reason's natural vocation? It's like the, I mean, I can't that brings me in mind of the beginning and this reflection on reason having this natural its nature is almost like it's transcending itself. It has this like self-transcending nature, and it does that by means of posing to itself problems that it itself can't resolve, and something
Mhm.
happens that it transcends itself, but that transcending process can give us the situation where we develop these semblances and prized delusions, like a pie in the sky or a castle in the sky or however it's spoken about, um,
Yeah.
that we then use reason to uphold. Um, but then it's being said that that's not the natural vocation of reason. So then the only thing that I can say in terms of why that wouldn't be would be that it needs to be um, appropriate, relevant to experience. Um, and so there's something natural about reason wanting to be, now I don't quite know how to like express it, but to be like uh, true to or relevant to or um, uh, to something that is not its, what do I want to say, like not itself or um,
Yeah.
like
Uh,
experience.
yeah. I mean, this is a big issue, right? I think, and it's one of the places where like Kant is maybe, I don't want to say shaky because I don't think that it's necessarily wrong, but it's one of the places where he gets pushed, right? That reason has, firstly, that reason has a natural vocation seems like a big like assertion to make, right? That it's got some purpose of end that it's working towards. That
Yeah,
its natural vocation is experience is also massive, massive claim. Like, why not
yeah,
why not like the mystical? Why not like God or reason? I don't know. Yeah, these are good questions, right? They are important, and maybe they'll become clearer throughout the text. Maybe they won't. Um, I will tell you, uh, there is an explanation for it right at the end of the text. So if you want to reflect on it when we get there, maybe next year or something like that, then feel welcome to. Um, think about how satisfying or unsatisfying the account is um, for yourself,
mm,
and figure out whether you do think that reason must be relevant to experience or why it ought to be. We might get a sort of like preliminary explanation in the second preface or in the introduction to the A edition. I can't remember.
okay,
You'll speak about Plato um, at some point, and
sure,
there will be some sort of inkling to give you like a flavor of why he has them.
yeah,
But it is bizarre to say the least. Um, and I guess maybe you might want to think about, I guess, what the world is, what metaphysics is, right? What
mm,
being, right? is being like some reclusive sort of God type thing that hides in the shadows by itself? Or does it spread itself through love in the world? Or I don't know. Is being experienceable? Like, can we have an
Mm.
experience of being? Or is it some non-experiential, like transcendent thing that never shows itself in experience? These questions all relate, I guess, to the prime question of metaphysics, which is what is being? Uh, and how can we, I guess, come to know it? But yeah, I
Yeah.
don't have a satisfactory answer for you.
Yeah. Yeah. You're doing all right with time there?
Yeah, I think we should be good. Um, yeah, I
You want to call it here?
think this is a good place to call it. From what I can
Where?
remember, at just before in this business, so just
Yeah.
uh,
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's probably a good place.
we've gotten through
Yeah.
almost a page, right? I feel like that's
Yeah.
pretty good for a discussion on the critique of pure reason.
It took us,
How long? How far?
we, this, the first one was, remember we had this conversation about truth. And then
Yeah.
Sipho, at the end of it, he was like, he posed this problem of the skeptic and the community of thinkers that the skeptic is in. I think that was the problem. And then like we started this series, Can't Make Time, and I think it was like it, it took us like 3 sessions to get to the text.
Yeah.
And then now this is the third session, really really working with it. But I think there's something to that, just like um
Look,
the manner of approach, like it's
look, Dan, we're three
yeah.
pages into the critique of pure reason in 3 sessions. I think we're doing, if anything, we're probably going too fast. 3 pages in,
Yeah.
you gotta be mad. Technically, if you wanna like, I'm pretty sure the text is 725 pages, so you can have the amount of sessions mapped out in your head according to the number of pages that we've covered so far.
Wow. I'm so glad YouTube does the storing for the data, because I'm not gonna buy more cloud space. It's uh, it's funny, like the last few sessions have been really high value.
Yeah.
Um, but I think for the potential others who might listen or never listen, I think it's going to be a uh, like a maturing. The value is going to mature through time. At least in the writing that I was doing today, I was drawing on the last couple sessions. So it's very helpful to like um I will express something, and then I can point to, like, if someone has the desire, like, oh, I want to grapple with this a little bit, then this at
Mhm.
least exists as
Yeah.
a grappling. It's just um yeah, sure. It's rad. Shall we leave it there?
I think so. I think it's a good testament to the difficulty of engaging with the text.
Yes. Yes. Rad.